Hi children, it's Grandma Carla with more of Freddy Goes to Florida. This is chapter 12. During the next 2 months, they visited all of the principal points of interest in Florida and saw all there was to see. They visited Palm Beach and the Everglades and Miami and the Big Spruce Cypress Swamp. And it was on the way across a corner of the swamp that they had a very exciting adventure. It happened this way. When they first came to the swamp, most of the animals were afraid and did not want to go into it at all. For it stretched for miles and miles, and there were no roads or paths, and there was no firm ground to walk on, only water and mud and the great twisted, gnarly cypress roots. It was dark, too, because the trees grew so thick. But Jinx said, "Oh, come on. Let's see what it's like. We don't have to go very far in. What are you afraid of?" And so they started in. At first, it wasn't very hard walking, but soon the mud and the water got deeper and the trees thicker together, and after a while longer, there wasn't anything to walk on at all, only water and trees. "I'm going back," said Mrs. Wiggins, and the other animals said they were too. Even Jinx agreed that they couldn't go any further. But when they started to go back, they found that they hadn't the slightest idea which to go. They had turned and twisted in and out among the trees so many times that they didn't know from which direction they had come. The water covered their footprints so that they couldn't follow them, and over their heads the branches were so thick that they couldn't see the sun. "Now we are in a mess," said Henrietta, who had been riding on Hank's back. "I hope you're satisfied, Jinx." "It won't help to call names," said Mrs. Wiggins. "Come along. Let's try this direction. One way is as good as another, and this looks as if it might be right." And so they went on, with Mrs. Wiggins in the lead. It was very dark and dismal. The water was black, and the long beards of gray moss hung down from the branches of the trees. Again and again they had to swim, and the animals who could not swim climbed on the larger animals' backs. At last it seemed as if they were coming out to a dry land. Ahead of them they could see sunlight through the tree trunks, and they floundered and stumbled onward as fast as they could go. In a few minutes they came out on the bank of what seemed to be a small canal, and beyond the canal was a grassy meadow, green and pleasant in the bright sun. "Well, this certainly isn't the way that we came," said Mrs. Wiggins, "but my word, that grass looks good. I guess we could get away with a few mouthfuls of it, hey, Hank? Come along, animals, let's swim over. It's something to stand on at any rate." "Look out! Don't bump your noses on the log," said Jinx, pointing with one claw to what looked like a lot of tree logs lying half under the water in the middle of the canal. So they all swam over, but as they were climbing out on the farther bank, Henrietta began to cackle excitedly. Look, the logs are coming to life!" And sure enough, what they had thought were logs were suddenly starting to swimming after them. They were alligators. "I certainly do not like this place," said Mrs. Wiggins. But like most cows, she had a stout heart and turned around and lowered her horns and shook them threateningly at the alligators. "Keep away now," she said. "We won't stand for any nonsense." But the alligators only laughed, and one of them said, "Ho, ho, you won't, eh? Well, what did you come into our country for, then?" "We're peaceable animals," said Mrs. Wiggins, "and all we ask is to be shown the shortest way out of your country. We are lost, and we shall be very much obliged to you if you will help us find ourselves again. But if you won't help us, we shall have to go on and find our own way out." Then all of the alligators laughed so hard that 2 of them choked, and their friends had to whack them on the backs with their tails. And they said, "Do you know where you are? You are on an island in the middle of alligator country. You can't get away. And tonight, we alligators are going to have you for supper." The animals saw now that they were indeed in a bad fix. "This is even worse than being fricasseed," said Charles. But Freddy, the clever pig, had an idea. And although he was very much scared, he said to the alligators, "Gentlemen, you will make a very great mistake if you eat us. We are not ordinary animals. We are the first animals in the world who ever migrated. We have come from far in the north. Thousands of miles we have traveled to visit your beautiful country and to take back word of its loveliness to our people. Surely you would not want to be so inhospitable as to eat us for supper." "He speaks very nicely," said one of the alligators, "but I am sure he would taste even better. He is so round and plump." But another one said, "There may be something in what you say, Pig. We will take you to the grandfather of all of the alligators, and you may tell him what you have told us. And perhaps he will let you go. And perhaps he will eat you for supper just the same. But that is for him to decide." And so he led them across the island to where the water and the swamp began again on the other side. And he stood on the bank and called, "Oh, grandfather of all the alligators, there be strangers here who would have speech with thee." Nothing happened for some time, and then there was a bubbling and a boiling of the water, and a huge head, as big as a barrel, appeared, and after the head a body as long as Mrs. Wiggins, and Hank and Jack and Robert and Freddy all together. It was the grandfather of all of the alligators, and he was so old that there was green moss growing all over him. He opened one wise old eye, and his deep grumbling voice said sleepily, "What do they want?" "They don't want to be eaten for supper," said the other grandfather. "Eat them for lunch, then," said the grandfather of all the alligators, and he began to sink out of sight again. But Freddy rushed down to the edge of the water and shouted, "Oh, grandfather of all of the alligators, we are strangers in your beautiful country, and we have come thousands of miles to visit you and tell you of our own land of which you have never heard." The grandfather of all the alligators opened both eyes and stopped sinking. "Why didn't you say so in the first place?" he asked. "That alters the case entirely. I hear very little news of the great world in this quiet spot. By all means, tell me of your home." "Oh, grandfather of all the—" Freddy began, but the grandfather of all the alligators stopped him. "It will be better," he said, "if you simply call me grandfather." And he closed his eyes and sank till everything but his ears were under the water and prepared to listen. Then Freddy told of the life that they had lived up north on Mr. Bean's farm, and of how cold it was this winter, and of their trip south. Every time he stopped for breath, the alligators, who were sitting around in a circle, would say, "Yes, yes, go on." And Freddy went on until he was very tired, and then Jinx took up the story until he was very tired, and then Charles went on with it. And by the time Charles was finished, and they had told everything they could possibly think of, it was almost sunset. Then the grandfather of all the alligators came up to the top of the water again and opened his eyes and said, "I thank you for telling me us of your wonderful country. It has been very interesting. And now, as it is almost supper time, we will go on with the feast. I am sure you will all taste very much better for the entertainment that you have given us." At this, the animals were very much alarmed. "You don't mean to say that you meant to eat us at all the time?" they cried. "Why, of course," said the grandfather of all the alligators. "Nothing was ever said about our not eating you, was there?" This made the animals very angry, and Jinx was so mad that he almost had a fit. "You mean to say," he screamed, "that you've gone and let us talk ourselves hoarse for nothing? You great big muddy long-nosed leather-skinned hippopotamus, you! You ought to be ashamed of yourself. What do you suppose all of the animals up north are going to think of you when they hear about it? Eating up visitors who come to make you a friendly call. A nice opinion they'll get of Florida." "My goodness, I should say so," exclaimed Mrs. Wiggins. "And the President of the United States, too. He shook hands with us and wished us a pleasant journey. What'll he say?" "He'll send his army down here and drive all of you alligators out into the ocean. That's what he'll do," said Jinx. The grandfather of all the alligators smiled, and his smile was 8 feet broad. "What you say may be so," he remarked, "but who's going to tell him? Answer me that. Who's going to tell him? You, madam?" he asked Mrs. Wiggins. "No, I think not. You'll be eaten up, horns, hoofs, and tail. And so—" But Henrietta interrupted. "We're going to tell him," she said. "My husband and I. You may eat the animals, but you can't eat us because you can't catch us. We can fly." "My dear," said the grandfather of all the alligators, "I am more than 800 years old. I was centuries old when Ponce de Leon came to Florida to look for the fountain of youth. I remember Balboa well, a tall man with a black beard and a shiny steel hat. He made the same mistake you did, my friends. He mistook me for a log. But he was more fortunate than you. He got away with merely the loss of one of his boots." The grandfather of all the alligators smiled at the memory. "A delicious boot that was, too. Old Spanish leather. I chewed on it for half a day." "Yes, as I was saying, I am very old. Yet in all of my 800 years, I've never seen or heard of a hen or a rooster that could fly like other birds." Now it is true that hens and roosters cannot fly as well as most birds, but they don't like to be reminded of it. Henrietta became very angry. "Is that so?" she exclaimed. "Well, if you've kept your eyes shut for 800 years, it's no wonder you don't know anything. Never saw a rooster who could fly, eh? Well, you're going to see one now. Charles," she said to her husband, "fly up in those trees on the other side of the water." Now, the trees were quite a long way off, and Charles had never in his life flown farther than from the ground to the top of a fence. "Good gracious, Henrietta," he whispered, "I can't fly up there. I won't be able to go half that distance, and I'll drop into the water, and the alligators will eat me." "They'll certainly eat you if you don't fly up there," she whispered back. "You've got to do it. It's our one chance of escaping. If they think you will go back and tell the president, they will let us go." "Well," said Charles, "I'll try it." And so he kissed Henrietta goodbye and squared his shoulders and flapped his wings and started, while all of the animals cheered and the alligators giggled and poked each other in the ribs with their elbows. Charles flew up into the air, up, higher than he had ever been before, as high as the tops of the trees, and then he started across the water. Down below, the animals held their breath as they watched him. They saw him flapping his wings so hard that feathers flew out of them and floated downward, but he could not get any higher. He was coming slowly down toward the water, and two of the alligators plunged in and swam out to be under him when he came down. "He'll never make it," said Mrs. Wiggins sadly, "never in the world." But suddenly, they saw him stop moving his wings. He spread them out and held them motionless, and then, to the amazement of all of the onlookers, he went straight across the water, faster, faster, and landed with a flutter in the trees. What had happened was this. There was a strong wind blowing across the swamp, but the island, shut in by the walls of high trees, was like a room, and the wind did not come in down out there at all. It was this wind that had caught Charles and blown him safely across. But of course, none of the onlookers knew this, and they thought that he had done it himself. Then all of the animals set up a great cheer, and the alligators had nothing to say at all. And the grandfather of all of the alligators opened his eyes wider than he had opened them in 600 years and exclaimed, "Well, upon my word, I never should have believed it, never." But Henrietta said, "Now, what are you going to do about eating us?" "Why, that was all a joke, my dear," said the grandfather of all the alligators. "We alligators will have our little joke, you know. Do tell your accomplished husband to come back so that we can thank him for his fine exhibition, and then he will show you the way out of the swamp and part in peace and goodwill." "Oh, yes, you old fraud," said Henrietta. "Ask him to come back so that you can eat him." "No, Charles will stay right where he is, in the top of that tree. All of the alligators will have a little joke, you know," and here's a picture of them, all laughing and pretending like it's a big joke. I think they're just trying to get Charles back over on the island, don't you? "Your suspicions are most unjust," said the grandfather of all of the alligators with a sigh. "We wouldn't harm him for worlds. We respect him and admire him greatly. However, I see you are anxious to be gone, and it is indeed getting late. My children," he said to the alligators, "show these animals safely to the edge of the swamp, and see that no harm comes to them. Goodbye, my friends. I thank you one and all for your entertainment. I am sorry that you took our little joke in earnest. However, that is past now. No hard feelings, I trust. Oh, none at all, said Henrietta sarcastically, and the grandfather of all of the alligators sank slowly out of sight. The alligators showed the animal a dry and easy path to the edge of the swamp, and they were very happy when they were on dry land once more. Charles had not come down from within reach of the alligators, but had fluttered along in the top treetops. Then the alligators said goodbye and wished them a pleasant journey. When the animals had gone a little way, they looked back and saw the alligators sitting in a row and looking after them. And great tears were rolling from their eyes and dropping to the ground, and the sound of their sobbing could be heard for miles. Why, I believe they really are very sorry to have us go, said Alice the duck. I suppose it is lonesome in that dreary swamp. Humph, said Henrietta. Of course they're sorry, but they're not crying because they like us. They're crying because they'll have to go to bed without their supper tonight. And this is Grandma Carla, and I love you.